So here we are, a good 2 months into life with COVID-19, and I don't know about you, but I thought initially I was coping quite well with the whole situation. Now, I'm prone to a bit of anxiety at the best of times, let alone when we're in a global pandemic situation. But despite having real reasons to be anxious as well, working as a GP, seeing how virulent COVID-19 is, how quickly it spreads, seeing potential cases face-to-face of COVID-19, even just going out to work every day and not staying safe at home, all could cause anxiety, but I was doing okay. I've been trying to stay positive, I've been trying to make the most of lockdown, trying to see the perks of it, focusing on what I'm grateful for rather than all the things that we're missing out on or reminiscing about life pre-COVID. And I think I've been intentionally not allowing myself to think about maybe what the future might hold as well. Maybe that how we can come through this and all the barriers to that, I just haven't been taking that into consideration, not worth thinking about. And that seems all quite positive, right? And I think I might have taken it too far. I think I've been a bit too kind of willfully ignorant in order to protect myself to get through this. And I think I strayed into maybe burying my head in the sand and not really facing the situation to try and avoid all the potential anxiety and the pain of the situation we're in. And I realised this the other day when I was caught off guard by one of those Facebook videos that just comes up, when you're scrolling away. And it was someone who was recounting this just horrific situation they'd been through as a result of COVID-19. And they were talking in depth about the terrible pain from the situation. It just hit me like a ton of bricks. And I think we all have our own coping strategies, don't we, in challenging times. They can be healthy, but they can be unhealthy. They can be wise and helpful to an extent, but then maybe they can stray into becoming unhelpful. During this pandemic, I think we are all united in our struggle, whether we're either in the midst of a deeply stressful and challenging situations or whether we're being concerned about all the challenges that could come as a result of the pandemic. And all the what ifs. What if I get sick? What if someone I love gets sick? What if they end up in hospital? What if my business goes under? What if I lose my job? What if I can't pay the bills? What if my child's education is compromised? All of those what ifs. And we can be consumed by the pain, the stress, the heartache that could come from any one of those things if they do come to pass. And I'm confident that everyone tuning in to this online service, wherever you are in the world, whether you will either be in the middle of a very challenging time or worrying about something bad that might happen as a result of the pandemic. So I want to address that today. I want to talk about pain. Not physical pain, but emotional pain. Pain meaning stress, anxiety, dread, grief, sadness, all the emotions that come with a really challenging time in life. I want to talk about what we do in the midst of our pain, but also the prospect of pain. The anxiety that comes with when we are faced with all those bad things that could potentially happen. Because I think there are two broadly different ways that we cope with the pain or the prospect of pain. On one end of the spectrum, we've got those of us that like to take action. We like to face the challenge head on. We like to look at all the potential eventualities and make a plan to cope with each one. We try and fix things. We get things sorted. We like to take control. But maybe we try and control the uncontrollable in a bid to lessen the impact of the worst case scenario by being prepared for it. And some of that does sound good, but if we dwell too much on the what ifs and plan for them, then we end up expending far too much energy on something that may never happen. At the very extreme, we end up experiencing the pain of a potential situation that we're trying to even avoid in the first place. Then on the other end of the spectrum, we've got those of us who don't acknowledge the potential for pain. I definitely fell into this camp at the start of this pandemic. In a good way, we focus on the here and now. We enjoy the most we can today and we don't worry about the things of tomorrow that we don't have control over. We don't dwell on the things we don't have control over. But we extend this to maybe distracting ourselves from the prospect of pain, ignoring it perhaps, pretending maybe that it's not going to happen. We end up not dealing with pain, not addressing or engaging with a situation in a meaningful way when it needs to be. We end up burying our heads in the sand. You might identify with either one of those camps or somewhere in the middle or at different times, but both strategies have their positives and negatives. And perhaps we should aim to be somewhere in the middle. But ultimately, both these strategies are a response to the fear of pain in our lives. Fear of pain manifests itself as anxiety, worry, stress. So why are we so afraid of pain? Why do we develop these strategies, maladaptive or not, to cope with the prospect of pain or pain itself? I think we do it because we fear we won't be able to cope with the pain. So what do we do then? How do we cope with the pain? How do we cope with the prospect of pain? I think we need to look for guidance from someone who has experienced more than their fair share of pain in their lives. That person I want to focus on today is the Apostle Paul. See, Paul is the man behind a significant proportion of the books of the New Testament in the Bible. He's a man who endured great hardship and persecution, which you can read all about in his many books. And I want to focus on something that he wrote to a letter to the church in Corinth in 2 Corinthians 1, because I think it gives us an insight into how we can cope with the prospect of pain or pain itself. So he's writing here in the church. He's writing to the church to update them about a very difficult situation that he and others faced when they were in Asia. And he says this in 2 Corinthians 8-11. We're in the Message translation. He says, "We don't want you in the dark, friends, about how hard it was when all this came down on us in Asia province. It was so bad we didn't think we were going to make it. We felt like we'd been sent to death row, that it was all over for us." So Paul was facing such a dire situation that he thought he was going to die. It was so bad that he thought, this is it for me. I can't get through this. It was all over as far as he was concerned. And he goes on to say this: "As it turned out, it was the best thing that could have happened." What? His near-death experience was the best thing that could have happened. Why? Let's read on. He says, "Instead of trusting in our own strength or wits to get out of it, we were forced to trust God totally. Not a bad idea, since He is the God who raises the dead. And He did it, rescued us from certain doom. And He'll do it again, rescuing us as many times as we need rescuing." So when Paul was facing the worst case scenario, something so bad that he thought he was going to die, he said it was the best thing that could happen to him. Wow. So why? Why was this pain so positive? Because it forced him to trust God totally. You know, we fear pain or even just the prospect of pain because we are afraid we won't be able to cope. We worry that we can't get through it. And probably we're right. You know, we can't handle it on our own. We don't have all the answers, but our ways of dealing with bad situations will only get us so far. We can't cope, but God can. Our challenge is God's opportunity. You know, when we are at the end of ourselves, when we are maxed out on our own capabilities, this is where God begins. Our end is where He is just getting started. You know, it is where we allow Him to intervene because we have no other option. In our insufficiency, we experience God's all-sufficiency. In our insufficiency, we experience God's all-sufficiency. So perhaps we should not fear pain as much as we do. Perhaps, like Paul, it could be the best thing that ever happens to us. I'm not saying that God causes the pain so we can have a positive experience afterwards. He didn't cause this pandemic. He didn't make the terrible things that people are going through right now in the world happen. But He will use it, and He will bring us through it if we trust Him. So how do we do this? How do we trust God in our pain? How do we trust God in the prospect of pain? How can we develop this trust in God to help calm our anxieties about the future? You may be sitting at home saying back to the TV right now, well, it's all well and good you saying we need to just trust God, Helena, but how do I actually do that? How does that help me in the pain that I'm going through right now? You may be listening at home now and thinking, well, I don't even believe in the God that you're speaking of, so I don't really think that's relevant to me. How can I trust something that I don't believe in? Well, can I encourage you just to stick with me? What I cover now, I hope will be practical and there'll be something in it for everyone. I can't claim to understand what everyone is going through right now. I can't even grasp the depths of the pain that some people may be experiencing. I can't fathom the anxiety that is going on at the prospect of pain in this pandemic. I can't say that all of this is going to be easy to get through, but I believe it is possible. So here are some practical things that I think if we do daily, it will help build our trust in God in the midst of our pain and at the prospect of pain. The first thing that I think we can do in the midst of our pain or when we are facing the prospect of pain is examine the evidence. Let's look at what God has done and therefore what he can do in your situation. The first place we can look for examples of God's triumph over adversity is how he's worked in other people's lives in the accounts in the Bible. We can read of how he has helped ordinary, flawed people just like you and me who are facing life and death situations or facing great anguish and pain and how he helps them through it. We can also read of God's promises in the Bible and his power and his might. And I just want to encourage you to read the Bible daily to build your trust in God. It doesn't have to be multiple chapters. It could be targeted verses to help address your particular situation. At the moment, I love going through a devotional book that I have, which is just a verse a day, that's all. But it gives me the evidence and the reassurance I need that God can and will prevail no matter what situation I face. Another way we can examine the evidence of God's almighty power and ability to help us overcome adversity is to reflect on what he has already done in our lives and the lives of other people. Perhaps each day you could think of one example of how God has been at work in your life in the past and has brought you through something, or how he's done that for someone else. To remind yourself that actually if he can do that, then he can definitely do this. Examine the evidence. The second thing I think we can do in the midst of our pain or at the prospect of pain is to put in some perspective. Each day, probably at the start of the day, we need to give ourselves some perspective. The perspective that God is bigger than the problems that we face. That the pain is not going to be forever. We need to remind ourselves that God is creator of the universe. He is King of kings, mighty to save. There is no other name greater than his name, that there is no situation too great for him to fix. To tell ourselves that even though this problem may seem insurmountable to us, but it is not for God. We can give ourselves this perspective by praising God. Perhaps singing is your thing. Even if you can't hold a tune, it's still a great way to get some perspective. There are so many great songs out there that talk of the awesome power of God, and by singing them we are declaring his promises and power in our lives and giving ourselves some perspective. Perhaps singing is not the thing for you though. I would still encourage you to speak out something, to verbalise the promise and the power of God, declare God's authority over your situation. There is something so significant in this. And it just reminds us where our problem and our pain is and where it stands into relation to God. Put in some perspective. The third thing that we can do in the midst of our pain or at the prospect of pain is to phone a friend. When we are going through painful, challenging times, yes, we need to build our trust in God, but that doesn't mean we don't reach out for support from others. God created us to be in relationship with one another. We need each other, and this is not a sign of weakness. We can get so much benefit from talking to someone close to us. Someone that can encourage you in your faith in Jesus. Talking through things helps. It's therapeutic. Even maybe when the other person doesn't have all the answers. We can pray with one another. Ask other people to pray for you. Actually, Paul goes on to say that in the verses that we're reading to the church in Corinth. He says, you and your prayers are part of the rescue operation. I don't want you in the dark about that either. I can see your faces even now, lifted in praise for God's deliverance of us, a rescue in which your prayers played such a crucial part. Phone a friend. Reach out. Engage with our church community, as Pastor Tom has been so emphatic about recently since the start of lockdown, because it's so important. Yes, it looks different at the moment, but please don't let that stop you. Fill out a prayer request. Text someone to say you need to chat. Get into a house party online and just connect with other people. Phone a friend. Instead of fearing the pain, instead of anticipating it, instead of developing maybe maladaptive strategies to try and cope with it, let's acknowledge that yes, we cannot cope, but God can. Let's embrace our pain and say that in our insufficiency, God is all sufficient. When we are at the end of ourselves and our capabilities, that is, in the challenging times that we face, God is only just getting started. Our pain forces us to trust God totally. And we can develop this trust by 1, examining the evidence, 2, putting in some perspective, and 3, phoning a friend. Imagine if we did all this and it impacted our day-to-day life to the point where we did not fear pain. Imagine what life could be like. Imagine being able to look to the uncertainty of the future and confidently say, I'm going to be okay. It's all going to be okay because God will help me through it. Knowing that he won't actually just help us scrape through and survive, but he will cause us to thrive through our pain. He will bring us out the other side of our pain stronger than we ever were before. Imagine if we all came out the other side of this pandemic stronger in our faith, more resilient, more emotionally mature, maybe stronger physically, with stronger relationships, maybe new skill sets, new opportunities, who knows? Maybe one day we might look back at this pandemic and, like Paul, say, it was the best thing that could have happened to me.